A reading before the sermon. This is How Fascism Will Come by Terry Arrett, delivered on September 23rd, 2011. When fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross. Words attributed to Sinclair Lewis. When fascism comes, it will greet us with a smile. It will get down on its knees to pray. It will praise Main Street and Wall Street. It will cheer for the home team. It will clap from the bleachers when the uninsured are left to die in the streets. It will rally on the Washington Mall. It will raise monuments to its heroes and weep for them and place bouquets at their stone feet and trace with their fingers the names engraved on the granite wall and go on sending soldiers to die in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the deserts of Iraq. It will send doves to pluck out the eyes of its enemies, having no hawks to spare. When fascism comes, it will sit down for tea with the governor of Texas. It will pee in the mosques from California to Tennessee, chanting, "Wake up, America, the enemy is here." It will sing the anthems of corporatization, privatization, demonization, monopolization. It will be interviewed lovingly on talk radio. It'll have talking points and a Facebook page and a disdain for big words or hard consonants. It won't bother to read. It will shred all its books. It will lambast the teachers and outlaw the unions. When fascism comes, it will look good. It will have big hair, pressed suits, lapel pins. It will control all the channels. It will ride in on swift boats. It will sit on the Supreme Court. It will court us with fear. It will woo us with hope. When fascism comes, it will sell shares of itself on the stock market. It will get rich, then it will get obscenely rich, then it will stop paying taxes. It will leave us in the dust. It will kick our derrieres. It won't have to break a sweat to fool us twice. It will be too big to fail. When fascism comes to America, it will enter on the winds of our silence and indifference and complacency. And on that day, 100,000 poets will gather in bookstores and libraries, bars and cafes, in their houses and apartments, in schools and on street corners, they will gather. In Albania, Bangladesh, Botswana, Bulgaria, Chile, China, Czech Republic, Finland, Guatemala, Hungary, Macedonia, Malawi, Qatar, crying, laughing, screaming. They will wrap the sad music of humanity in bits of word cloth and hang them, like prayers, on the tree of life. I have been a student of history for a long time. Because of my interest in languages, specifically in French and Russian, I have also been a student of their peoples, their cultures, politics, economies, histories. It was in part my long-term interest in Russian history that I chose to study the language. People sometimes asked why I was studying foreign countries when we have our own right here. I think if I had been more exposed to the likes of Howard Zinn earlier, I may have taken more interest in our own. As it was, there was the important language connection, but also the fact that we can't experience everything ourselves. Sometimes we learn great lessons from others instead of from our own experiences. And so I have studied French history from the Gaul period to the early 2000s from both an American and a French perspective. and Russia from Rus forward from American, French, and Russian perspectives. I have learned about the risings and fallings of empires, kingdoms, and democracies. I've studied World War II, especially in both countries, the markedly different ways that each was a participant in the war, the way each suffered in the war, the way each helped create the world we live in now. I've even studied, in particular, anti-Semitism in both countries and anti-diversity trends and measures in both countries. I never realized that I might need to apply the hardest learnings of my life in this country, the supposed land of the free that once charged itself with making the world safe for democracy, which we are watching disappear with every passing month, with so many pieces of legislation, of judicial rulings, of bullying and manipulating by those who serve as elected or appointed officials, as well as by many in our own communities and perhaps families. Nation building has also needfully been a part of my studies, and it follows a standard playbook, which is one of the reasons why France and Russia, as well as the US, have gone through similar periods of identity creation, sculpted carefully and strategically. While these national identities have been used in conjunction with different forms of government, from democracies to authoritarian regimes, they have demonstrated carrying great value and continue to be exploited. Some of the strategies are the same as those being employed by those using fascist tactics to gain power today. In preparation for this service, I reviewed the Reverend Cecilia Kingman's amazing Berry Street essay delivered at our 2023 General Assembly, "My Little Pony Was Right, Fascisms Without and Within," along with the two respondents. Much of Reverend Kingman's lecture draws from Jason Stanley's book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, which she very clearly credits, and her own lifelong interest in authoritarianism and other practices where one seeks to gain control over others. I have also read Dr. Pamela Cooper White's The Psychology of Christian Nationalism, Angela Denker's Red State Christians, Understanding the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump, and Bill McKibben's The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon, which recounts his own experiences about things have changed so dramatically since 1970, with research to either affirm or challenge his anecdotes. Jason Stanley's work makes clear how various tactics are used to undermine democracy and make fascism an alternative or replacement. Democracy is, unfortunately, an easy political system to exploit. And while Stanley draws examples from many sources, the German Third Reich, Poland, Hungary, Russia, Myanmar, he also looks at both contemporary US politics and from our history, including the Reconstruction era, which I am sure some of you have become familiarized or refamiliarized with thanks to the work of Heather Cox Richardson. Stanley lists 10 tactics used for fascist ends and goes into each with detail and clarity, somewhat surprisingly, as these tactics can't be fully isolated from each other. They work in conjunction with each other, and as Kingman says, it's not that each of these makes a politician or political movement fascist, but when these elements are present in number, and especially when people are told that they are under an existential threat from some created other, then that is fascism. The 10 tactics are a mythic past, propaganda, anti-intellectualism, unreality, hierarchy, victimhood, law and order, sexual anxiety, Sodom and Gomorrah, the urban versus rural divide, and Arbeit macht frei. For each of these, reality doesn't have a role. What is true doesn't factor in. We've seen this with, just for an example, some people saying over and over again that the 2020 election was stolen, even when earlier this year, Rudy Giuliani was ordered to pay $148 million to election workers for defamation, and the Fox News Corps agreed to pay $787 million to Dominion Voting Systems for lying about the machines switching votes. Almost $1 billion in reparations being paid, and yet we still hear the 2020 election was stolen. And so we build from here. The mythic past can be an unspecified or specified time in the past that was better, that appeals to a certain group of people or certain groups of people, like white, middle class, straight, cis, non-disabled people who feel like they're being persecuted because they're being told they cannot have all the equality for themselves, mostly because that's not how equality works. It's a glorious past that has been lost, probably because of them, and gives a sense of nostalgia. Propaganda is a tool that everyone uses, but under fascism, its goal is division. It digs in deep to us versus them, friends versus enemies, with the enemies always being some other that is opposed to us and the nation, those threats that we hear about all the time. Anti-intellectualism is a simplifying of ideas, even an oversimplifying of ideas. This is where book banning comes into play. Complexity is unwelcome and even viewed as a threat. One dominant perspective is all that's considered acceptable. We see this with the shutdown of learning about LGBTQIA+ folks, BIPOC folks, and others. Unreality. This is the realm of the so-called alternative facts. Bless you. People are trained to the idea that everyone is lying and that the lies don't matter. We keep repeating the same story even when it's been proven untrue, unfactual. Democracy requires truth to function. Hierarchy is all about superiority and is a core element of fascism. White supremacy, male supremacy, able-bodied supremacy, heteronormativity are all forms of supremacy that convince some that they are better than others. This goes straight into victimhood. When people believe they are superior, any threat to that superiority and the privileges that come with it result in a sense of victimhood, even when equality is the goal. The loss of superiority leads those who have been in power to feel victimized. Law and order. That is, law-abiding means loyalty to the dominant group. This element is a reinforcement of us versus them and has to do with legitimacy, not legality. We are law-abiding, they are criminals. We remember how a former president talked about immigrants and people in other countries in the 2016 election run-ups with derogatory language I will not repeat. Sexual anxiety, also assault, is element 8. One message always conveyed is that women and children are under threat. Remember talk about those criminals who would rape women and the child sex trafficking rings that Democrats were running out of restaurants or something? This is also where queer LGBTQ+ folks are again othered. They want to destroy our way of life. They are coming for our children. Sodom and Gomorrah. This point is where the urban-rural divide is expressed. Rural is synonymous with hardworking, whereas inner city means Black and queer folks, Jews, immigrants, and others who are lazy and don't want to work. They are all people fascists want to control or eliminate. And last, Stanley is a child of Holocaust survivors. Arbeit macht frei, work shall make you free, was over the gate at Auschwitz. The narrative for immigrants, liberal college students, most marginalized people, etc., is that they are too lazy to work, and those who don't work have no value. In this chapter, he talks about the ways that fascist ideology becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, Through racism, as one example, and incarceration and a weakened social safety net, those who are incarcerated are significantly impacted and unable to re-enter the workforce, leaving them vulnerable to going back to prison. This point also tears into labor unions because they bring workers together across class lines, removing race, religion, and other charged dividing aspects of identity. They become villains because they're working for equality and better conditions for workers. It was important to me to take some time to at least bullet point these 10 elements as we see them not only in our national politics, but of course here in Florida, including our counties and our local politics. But we've also seen them in our national UU conversations and in our congregations. These tactics have been so commonly used that they have seeped into our faith. I'm not going to get into the many various tactics to try to resist these elements today, as it's a complicated and multi-pronged effort, and that's a bit of what part 2 is about. Service next week will conclude my thoughts. But we do need to be aware of these elements and whether the conversations we're having or listening to are making use of these tactics. If so, we must be wary. When they happen within Unitarian Universalism, we must try to bring our dialogue partners back into right relationship with reality and our faith, along with us as individuals. That said, I have been so resistant to doing any learning on Christian nationalism and fascism and why it's so popular in the US right now. Certainly not our first experiences with this as a country, but the first of such magnitude certainly in my own lifetime. As someone who has beloveds who are queer, BIPOC, disabled, and otherwise marginalized, I have not wanted to have compassion for those who are causing such significant harm and distress. But I recognize its importance in this moment. So, while all the reading I've done has been insightful, what I haven't seen much about is the deep spiritual issues underlying the rise of fascism, and I want to explore this a little today. Thank you to my years of chaplaincy for help with this angle. So looking under the surface of what these 10 tactics are getting at and building on is a sense of disconnect between the us and the them. Nationally, this looks like the rising number of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who are people of the global majority. The seeming rising number of queer LGBTQIA+ folks. The seeming rising number of disabled folks. The seeming rising number of all marginalized folks. Those who have been privileged in any number of ways are seeing the world around them change, and that change feels like marginalization. It's worth noting that the identities where it's a seeming increase in numbers is just a reflection of the fact that we, are allowed to live now, allowed to be out more regularly, and aren't facing the same levels of oppression or discrimination as in the past. Not to imply that in any way oppression or discrimination are gone, it's just different now. That feeling of marginalization is important to name. While none of the fascist tactics reflect reality in terms of facts, they tap into people's feelings and emotions. It's those feelings and emotions that create a sense of shared meaning among the in-group that is also created through their manipulation. That's one reason why some campaigning has been so effective among certain kinds of people. Those who have been feeling angry, scared, distressed, powerlessness, or a loss of control, and so on, but had nowhere to direct these feelings. Certain campaigns have given the people with these feelings a sense of community by fostering a sense of belonging that might have otherwise been missing from their lives. Some speeches and rallies often seem irrational because they are. They tap into feelings, not thoughts. Rationality will not, cannot matter when people are so deeply in their feelings. There's no reasoning out of feelings at a certain point. These tactics are geared to generate response from those who are experiencing a sense of loss, those who are under or unemployed, whose work has been displaced or devalued. You know, we're protecting those American jobs while we're also sending them overseas. Those whose identity as men feels threatened by increasing gender equality. That's what we were rallying for yesterday, right? We have so much equality now that we're celebrating. Those whose identity as women, specifically white women, is bound to their relationship with the men whose sense of identity as superior is being disrupted. Those who are white feeling threatened by changing racial demographics. Those who feel their religion, evangelical and fundamentalist Christians, is being threatened and persecuted, and so on. These are losses, and big ones, because they're often so core to a person's sense of self and self-identity. They are losses that are reflected in the ways the world is changing, how our nation is changing. The American empire is collapsing. Those who have been in power at the top of the hierarchy are no longer seeing as much of themselves in those places of power. As those in power become more diverse, there's a feeling of not recognizing themselves, of not being represented or being seen, both in the world and possibly as much in their own lives. These changes are uncomfortable and scary. We know that hurt people, and hurting people also hurt people. Beneath the anger and all that comes with it, many of these people are feeling deep sadnesses and griefs and fears that they may not even be able to articulate. But they feel something familiar when certain candidates have rallies and address the media. They feel hope because the world makes sense for them there again. They understand that world. They understand the anger and frustration. These strong emotions give them a sense of power so they aren't left having to feel the emotions underneath. Their sadness, their scare, their fear. This month's spiritual theme is generosity, one of our new UUA values. The UUA's bylaws state about generosity. We cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. We covenant to freely and compassionately share our faith, presence, and resources. Our generosity connects us to one another in relationships of interdependence and mutuality. As a people committed to this kind of generosity and whose faith holds love at its center, we have to wonder what all of this means for us. How can we be generous, loving people, the kind that we believe ourselves to be, while holding firm in our resistance to fascism and those who spread it? We'll come back to this question and more next time, but for now, think about the ways that you will choose to bless the world, how you will celebrate the world we dream of as you use, the children to whom we will leave it, the ancestors from whom we received it, and how we might be our best selves. What do generosity and love ask us to do?